Well, the spotlight has been on the state's correction system this week. 10 guards at a Utica area prison were arraigned for murder and manslaughter in the beating death of a prisoner. Other officers at a Western New York prison started a wildcat strike, which ruffled its way across the state for 10 days, and the correction officers were complaining that the job's getting more dangerous and they need more staff. They also want a suspension in the stricter solitary confinement rules. Overnight, it appears that they have a tentative deal, and we're recording Friday morning, so Jenny, things may change that our viewers may know that we don't at this moment, but it sounds like the workers in this tentative deal got a lot of what they wanted.
Yeah, they very much did, and it's interesting and impressive and also puzzling at the same time. So if I were cynical, I would say that this wildcat strike was an intentional effort by the corrections officers to distract attention away from what happened with the brutal beating and death at Marcy Correctional Facility. So that's cynical. The less cynical part of me says that there are clearly issues happening in New York's correctional facilities. And thankfully we have Little Brother, that is cameras, that allow for insights that we didn't have before to see what was really happening in the inner workings, which allowed hopefully justice to come through for the brutal beating that happened in Marcy. But, you know, I think there are issues, right? There's the numbers of correction officers today actually is more proportionally to what it was at the high point in 1999. So basically the number of people who are incarcerated has dropped by half since 1999, but the number of corrections officers has actually only dropped by about 35%. So it's puzzling to me what's happening here. If the corrections officers are saying that they don't have enough staff, that they are facing a lot of potential danger, but there are actually more corrections officers today, what's happening in the system? So we need more accountability, we need answers, and we still don't have them.
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, I am cynical, and the way the strike occurred, it totally looked like that they're weaponizing the strike to basically minimize the brutal beating of Robert Brooks, which, by the way, was not caught on camera, it was accidentally caught, right? So we would not have known this, and of course, we don't know many of this brutality that goes on against prisoners. That should not take away from the fact that the prison guards have a difficult job. They are, you know, they are working with people who are not socialized into civil society and so on and so forth, and they should have some say. But, you know, I want to think about the word mercy, right? How do we do prisons? The word correction is a travesty, right? Everybody knows when you go into prison, you come out worse than that, and you can't find a job and you go back. So we could look at Norway, Sweden, and see that why they don't have this massively long-term solitary confinement, and they have very less recidivism rates. So maybe there is a place for guards to not dehumanize the prison population, but also for the civil society to have more compassion towards the guards as well, because they are doing a difficult job. They are facing violence and so on and so forth. But I don't think this long-term, more than 15 days of solitary confinement is good at all. It's inhuman, right? And I can't stand by that.
He's talking about the HALT Act, which the legislature passed a few years ago, and the guards are saying that it shifted the balance of power in the prisons and makes it more dangerous for them. So it's temporarily being suspended. The legislature didn't vote to repeal it, so should it continue? Do you have thoughts on this?
Actually, I think it should, but for the simple fact that the Attorney General's office did a report on the HALT Act. I think it came out in 2024. And part of the problem was the very poor record keeping of DOCCS, the Department of Corrections and Community Support, I think is what it's called. And part of the problem is there's very poor record keeping, so there really isn't any proof that the HALT Act doesn't work. But some of the things that the Attorney General's report found was that some prisons were actually attempting to implement the HALT Act, some weren't. It seemed to be very subjective. The alternatives to solitary confinement were sometimes being utilized, were not being utilized. And so part of the problem is you haven't really had true implementation to really know if it's working or not, so why suspend it if we don't really know it's working? But I also want to just add one other thing. one of the things that we often don't talk about is the mindset of people who become corrections officers. And I think it sort of varies, so I'll just mention two. One, you will find that often corrections officers beget corrections officers. So you have 2 and 3 generations sometimes of corrections officers. So if you've grown up with a certain mindset about prisoners, you become a corrections officer. To shift that mindset takes quite a bit, and that's part of what I think is working here. The other thing is that you often find that people who become corrections officers have a certain desire for a certain amount of power. The HALT Act removed power to a certain extent from the corrections officers. They didn't like it from the start, and I think this became an opportunity to try and get rid of something they didn't want anyway.
I want to go back to something that Jenny had said. I'm going to guess, but I don't know, that decrease in prison population is probably low-level drug offenders who had commuted sentences.
It's the reduction of the
And
Rockefeller.
the dangerous people remain. Simon Greer is a prominent progressive activist who works now to promote dialogue across difference. He wrote a paper in Salon, an article in Salon about 7 years ago, arguing that correction officers are on the front lines of this incarceration crisis, and their voices are too rarely heard. They're very often excluded, and that if progressives really want to pursue justice reform, they have to take seriously their experiences, even when they conflict with their progressive point of view. And so I think about easy areas of reform, which like chronic understaffing, mandatory overtime, easy access to contraband. These are things that amplify how dangerous our prisons are. And so those are the kinds of demands I would think about first. But Tara, I'm a little uneasy with some of the stuff you said, because I also want to recognize the stresses of that job. Correction officers experience PTSD at rates more than twice the level experienced by military veterans, and they experience suicide rates at twice the level of police officers. So this is a terribly dangerous, stressful profession, and so I think it's really important we listen to what they're saying about the stresses of that job.
Let me ask just quickly before we finish, Jenny, how about Governor Hochul's role in this? She handled this well or no?
I mean, it's a very tough position. If she had come out even stronger and executed mass firings, which potentially she could have done because the strike was illegal, then what, right? Because now you have no corrections officers, or very few in several of the facilities, and you can't have National Guard as your temporary, leading to potentially long-term. So it's a very tough position that she was in.